We've got a good group here. So our subject today is hot issues going into the Tokyo Olympic Games. We have a fantastic panel, which I'm going to introduce. I'm Maidie Oliveau. I am counsel at Errant Fox, representing clients on all sides of transactions, almost exclusively related to the sports industry, with an emphasis on international transactions and the Olympic movement, basically. I'm also an arbitrator on the Court of Arbitration for Sport and have served in that capacity on 5 ad hoc divisions at 3 Olympic Games and 2 Olympic Winter Games. And I'm active as an arbitrator for US sports-related issues such as selection cases and doping cases. So CJ Davis joins us. He serves as Assistant General Counsel, Head of Sports Business and Legal Affairs for Puma North America and Cobra Puma Golf. His responsibilities are centered on managing Puma and Cobra Golf's domestic and global sports licensing, marketing, and entertainment-based legal issues and business affairs. He represents Puma and the sporting goods industry on the Committee on International Sports Organizations and also the Athletics Committee for the World Federation of the Sporting Goods Industry. So CJ has been managing Puma's internal Olympic marketing and campaign strategy guidelines, working with the IOC on Rule 40 issues, signing athletes in advance of the games, and helping coordinate any internal logistics. Alana Hernandez is the Executive Vice President, Business Affairs and Operations of Wasserman's Team Sports Division, where she manages the legal and day-to-day operations of the group. In this role, Alana has negotiated and finalized contracts for Wasserman Olympic clients, among others, and she's charged with educating and informing the entire talent practice on important legal issues and industry trends, including the application of various Olympic rules, among others. I wasn't able to put in everybody's functions. I'm trying to shorten this, so you get the among others. Alana was a founding member of Wasserman's Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Council and is a co-leader of the DE&I subcommittee, which is dedicated to promoting and supporting women at Wasserman and within the industry as a whole. Alana also has been super busy in the lead up to the Olympic Games, renegotiating a variety of agreements for clients as a result of canceled events and appearances, and family and other personnel not being able to attend or travel to events due to COVID protocols, making sure agents, marketing team, and brand partners understand the parameters of the Olympic Charter Rule 40 and Rule 50. For example, can beach volleyball players have temporary tattoos promoting a brand? What are the do's and don'ts for non-Olympic sponsors of athlete clients? And the protest, Rule 50 part of her work has been interesting given her clients' current activities to promote social justice. And finally, but not least, Chris McCleary, who is General Counsel of the US Olympic and Paralympic Committee. He joined the USOPC from Visa Inc., where he served 8 years as the Senior Vice President and Senior Associate General Counsel of Global Brand and Client Management. In his role as General Counsel for the USOPC, he leads a team of legal professionals responsible for all USOPC legal, contract, intellectual property, and dispute resolution matters, as well as USOPC's government relations team based in Washington, DC. He also leads their government work and serves as corporate secretary to the USOPC Board of Directors and oversees their relationships with the World Anti-Doping Agency, the US Anti-Doping Agency, and Partnership for Clean Competition. In the run-up to the Olympic Games and Paralympic Games in Tokyo, Chris and his colleagues have been wrestling with a range of challenging issues around COVID safety, athlete demonstrations, supply chain and transportation, marketing and ambush marketing, team selection disputes, travel and visas, and who knows what else between now and September. He asks for your good thoughts and support for Team USA this year, which I'm sure we all happily give. So, as of tomorrow, all entries are technically due into the Tokyo Olympic Games. The last update for entries was on June 10th, and at that point, the IOC confirmed that approximately 8,500, or about 76% of all athletes expected at the Games had then qualified, and 17 sports had concluded the qualification process. So the entry deadline technically is tomorrow. There's always some issues, but it looks like there will be a complete field at the Olympic Games, which is very exciting considering what we've been through up to this point. So what we're going to do today is talk about 3 topics: COVID challenges, Olympic Charter Rule 40, and Olympic Charter Rule 50. We welcome your questions, and we will deal with them at the end because these subjects are going to interrelate, so it will make the most sense to deal with them at the end. Also, we are planning, just so you know, an interactive virtual outreach event after the Olympic and Paralympic Games have concluded, so sometime in September, which will be much more interactive as opposed to us making a presentation. So let's start on COVID challenges, and I'm going to start with Alana. And my question is, what were the legal challenges you faced directly tied to the postponement of the 2020 Games?
Thank you, Maidie. Thank you for having me. It's really nice to be here and to talk about this. So as I'm sure Chris and CJ and Maidie would agree, we could probably have an entire session on challenges to the Olympics as a result of COVID. But I would say that the biggest thing coming from the athlete management side was really trying to figure out how to handle agreements that were directly related to the Olympics. So a few major issues arose. We had brands trying to terminate agreements, arguing force majeure, and then us trying to determine whether we were going to fight that on behalf of the athletes. We had brands trying to suspend or amend agreements so that they would just be able to use the rights for an additional year, sometimes arguing force majeure. And I think at that point for us, the question became, okay, so yes, we don't want to terminate. We never want to do that, or we want our athletes to maintain their partners. But we also don't want exclusivity to just be hanging in the ballots for a whole year while we maybe have the Olympics in 2021. So really it was a lot of work, a couple months, really just trying to iron out all the details and overall figuring out how to maintain partnerships for our clients, but then also trying to figure out, are there increased promotional activities that we could do in this year-long wait that we have leading up to the Olympics? And obviously with that, we don't know everybody is going to make it to the second, set of when the Olympics was going to be 2020. Some people might have been available that aren't going to be available in 2021. And then at the same time, some clients that weren't going to be able to make it in 2020 might be going in 2021. So there was just a lot of us trying to be creative, a lot of virtual events to keep the partners interested and hanging around for a year. But we all figured it out. And at the end of the day, I think we realized that everybody really just wanted the relationships to work, the brands and our athletes. And at the, once we got down to it, I don't think we can even say that we had any deal that was actually terminated at the end of the day. So it ended up being, I think, a pretty good solution.
That's interesting, because that seems to be a consistent theme that we've seen from the beginning of this postponement. CJ, what about you? What legal challenges did you face tied into the postponement?
Yeah, thanks, Maidie, and thanks again for moderating this, and to everyone for joining on a Monday. Thanks for having me here. In terms of challenges, it's really run the gamut based on from when COVID first broke. I can remember last March, at least here in Boston, when things started locking down. We had just finished, and we'll get to this probably with Rule 40 later, but an IOC training on a track session. They have what they call for Rule 40 guidelines and things like that. And the next day it kind of broke what was happening, and The first was full stop, what's going to happen, when it's going to happen, how are we going to adjust? So I think to Alana's point, there was an athlete consideration first once the dust settled a little bit as to, expiring deals and how are these going to work. And as I think we've all dealt with to an extent, partnership was key in a lot of these and resolving these issues. But then from a Puma perspective, and I think the industry generally, it became a planning issue as to, we plan campaigns that are launching at certain times, product life cycles, are 18 months in advance, all these things that lead into not just the Olympics, but just, your summer plans, for example, and figuring out, okay, how do we adjust these things? Do you go forward with what your plans are? Do you hold, not knowing, are things going to happen in 2021? So that was the biggest challenge initially, figuring out what we do from a marketing and athlete side in terms of pressing pause. And now that we've evolved, or the situation has evolved over the last 12 plus months, what form are the games going to take? How are we going to get athletes there? How are we going to, have people on the ground to support our athletes, to do all of those things? And, in a country where, how does the population support the games? What's the vaccination situation going to look like? So all of these things have come into play over the last, I'd say, 4 to 5 months more so, and adjusting from, are the games going to happen? How are we going to do this? To, okay, they're happening. How are we going to do this? So a lot of mixed challenges in terms of planning, I would say, first and foremost.
Yeah, as you were talking, it just kind of reminded me that with Olympic sports, at least, contracts and planning and everything is done on a quad basis. So all of a sudden, the quad became something else. And then we have the Olympic Winter Games coming up 6.5 months later. So Chris, what about you? What about the USOPC? What challenges did you face directly tied to the postponement?
I mean, nothing much. It's been fine. Pretty much business as usual. The face you were just making, Maidie, is exactly, I don't know if anybody got a screenshot, but that's how I've been feeling for 13 months now. And so thanks everyone for letting me join. This is good stuff. And I think, we could go deep on all of these topics, but to be super brief, as you can imagine, the COVID-based changes, and you're exactly right, Maddie, it messes with the whole quad. The COVID-based changes to the games, were they going to happen? When are they going to happen? Impacted every single contract that we touch as an organization, all the way from the largest of our revenue items, all the way down to the smallest of our expense ones, right? The broadcast, the sponsors that we had, people that we were extending as a matter of good faith and trying to take into 2021, our high dollar hospitality that is sort of still in flux. We're not going to have any hospitality. So now what happens with the tour packages and with the tickets and the hotels and things? That is a house by house negotiation. And I know that we're all experiencing our different versions of this thing, but as a lawyer, which of us has ever dreamed we would say the words force majeure this many times in our lives, right? And that's what, and you can take that from every side, right? That term and the concept has been used in so many negotiations, so many ways. I'll shut up about that because we ought to turn to operationally, what does COVID mean for the games? But I will say as a lawyer, maybe some of us got together a year ago when it became clear it's not cancellation, it's postponement. All right, what does that mean? How do we think about these contract issues? And we were all speculating a little bit. This is the greatest force majeure-ish event in human history, at least in the sense of being a global business environment and having to deal with that. I feel like in the last year, I've learned more about my partners and negotiating partners and other businesses than maybe in my career up until then. It's been really revealing.
Okay, that face was worth recording. All right, so now I'm going to start with Alana again. What are the legal challenges you're dealing with now relating to restarting the games in 2021 both in terms of COVID and your internal planning?
Gosh, I mean, I think a lot of this goes to, some of the things that CJ was mentioning, just in terms of the vaccination requirements and getting your, for us, explaining to our athletes, like, what does that mean? What's the additional risk that you're taking of participating in the games, where they're not going to be able to tell you, yes, this person is vaccinated. I understand that the protocols in terms of passing the tests are very strict and everybody needs to adhere to that, but there is some risk with traveling. And then, I wasn't sure if it was CJ or Chris that mentioned, but what do the people in Japan feel like? Are they excited about having all of these foreigners coming into their country, and sort of, does that lessen the Olympic experience for the people that are going into the games, just feeling like it's a totally different kind of environment than they would be used to 5 years ago when they came to Rio? Getting our participants and staff there. I mean, we're not going to have any of our agents traveling over, whereas ordinarily we would have a lot of people there for our clients, to assist with process, to assist with getting deals, the requirements under the deals for endorsements finalized and integrated, and pictures taken and videos and all sorts of things. So we just have to sort of figure out how to do it from across the world, and just answering a lot of questions as to what are the games really going to be like this year? Is it going to feel the same? And that kind of a thing. But other than that, I think the contract stuff we figured out, and we sort of understand, God forbid we have to postpone them again if something crazy happens. But I think we've sort of figured out how to deal with those challenges. Yep. Did Maidie get cut off?
I think Maidie got tired of us. Let's keep going.
I don't know.
Yeah.
I mean, I think I agree with a lot of what Alana said. It turned quickly away from a force majeure issue, contract issue, to more of, okay, it's time to figure out how this is going to work and what it's going to look like. And a lot of that, not to the IOC or anyone's fault, really, was no one really knew. And that was the problem. It's really hard, at least from a brand perspective, to figure out how you're going to go about your plans. You've got a business to run, and are these games going to happen or not happen? And once they're going to happen, what's that form going to take? We have everything from ticketing credentials on the simpler side, to the logistics of getting everyone that we need to from athlete support into Tokyo, and who can go, how many can we go, how many can go. Once we figure that out, are people vaccinated to go? How are we going to handle those things? From a campaign perspective, again, like I mentioned earlier, and product cycle, all those things have to be changed, because you're a year removed, and the products you were going to use have changed, and all those things have changed. So logistically, on the ground in Tokyo, to all the way to internal planning, has been a complete, really overhaul and adjustment to get where we needed to be, I think.
I'm with both of y'all on that. And I'll say from the Olympic and Paralympic Committee side, I was talking about revenue and expense. We're all doing contract stuff. Well, the reason that you have us in the world is to gather a team and take them to the Olympic Games and the Paralympic Games, and to support the process and the athletes that aspire to get it to be a part of that team. So this year, when we talk about COVID, if we take the contract stuff as absolutely is at the core of this thing, well, what we've really been spending most of our time in is how can we keep athletes safe through our trials environments. So for the first half of the year, right, we've been busy with Olympic and Paralympic trials. And we're all in a great mood at my place here today, because last night they ended. We finished the last gymnastics and track and field trials. And I'll tell you, it's working, right? All the COVID protocols and all the worrying that people have been doing, and all the quarantining rules and the testing rules, it's been very painful and messy, because none of us has ever tried to do a thing like this. But I'll tell you, from my perspective, it's been amazing to me what people on the planet have accomplished, because we ran all the trials in all the sports. Maidie mentioned it. We're on deadline now to name our team, Team USA, for the Tokyo Games. And we're so excited that we get to do that. But from the legal perspective, I can't tell you how much time we spent trying to build our COVID protocols for the trials to keep people safe and give them a heads up on what was expected of them. And then while we're watching the Tokyo protocols for the games be put together, and think about how are we going to comply with that. So just from a team perspective and thinking about athletes getting ready to head over there are so many ways to mess up your Tokyo experience this time because of this COVID layer. Understandably, Alana, exactly as you said, how are people going to feel in Japan about having us all come there? Well, we better behave, right? We better stick to the rules. We better be not a risk to the people that live in that country. So understandably, there are layers and layers of requirements and testing requirements and tracking requirements and retesting requirements. And so I'll tell you, as the biggest Olympic and Paralympic committee on the planet, we are up at night trying to check and double check our plans and the way we're going to support athletes through that. And even then, we're kind of biting our nails a little bit. People think in terms of getting to Japan and being allowed into the country, and then being able to move around in the country and hold the games. I'm with both of you that this is it's understandable, it's unprecedented, but this is not over in terms of getting through this COVID environment. And really at this point, it's got to be all about support of the athletes that need to compete in that environment.
Yeah, and Chris and Alana as well, just a question on my end out of curiosity. Did either of you, either Alana from an athlete perspective or Chris, Team USA perspective, have any athletes that had qualified pre-COVID for the 2020 games that did you have any of the, I had heard about those scenarios early on. I'm not sure how many of them were actually out there, but did you have any scenarios like that? And how did those work in practice for you?
No, we didn't. We do have an athlete, not Team USA, from another country who gave birth during COVID last year, shortly before the Olympics, and is now trying to make the team for her country. So she would not have had an opportunity if the Olympics happened last year, and she still maybe does have an opportunity this year. So we on the opposite end, but no, not anybody that qualified previously and isn't able to this year.
And I don't know what the numbers are exactly, but CJ, it is absolutely happening. There are great stories of athletes that never would have been able to have a go, and there are terrible stories of athletes that had everything wired and weren't going to get to go and can't. It's really interesting to me, and Alana, you've probably had insight to this all along, but a thing that has been made clearer to me, a lawyer back in the boiler room at this place, is that you think of the games as a kind of a moment, but getting ready for an event of that scale has the longest lead in and a fair tail for any athlete that really wants to be serious about doing that. So even a year ago and more, right, when we were 6 months out from the games, when people were starting to worry a little, we were 4 or 5 months out from the games before things were seriously being disrupted. That was already raining chaos on athletes and their preparation plans and their qualification plans. So the idea of just, well, why don't we just hold it a month later somewhere else or move it to this other place? It's sort of comical. It's not just hard from the organizer's perspective. It's just murder on the athletes, I think.
Yeah, no, agree. I mean, it's finding places to train was crazy during COVID. To keep oneself in that sort of a physical condition for an additional year, I think is asking a lot. Not all athletes are training, like in NBA or WNBA, and it's not like they're doing that all the time. So, yeah, it was a struggle for sure, and we had a lot of interesting conversations trying to get our clients to just figure out what to do and to keep themselves in shape for. At one point, we just didn't know for how long, and then at another point for another year. So yeah.
So with that, I guess on the COVID front, maybe we transition over to Rule 40 a bit, get into some of the meat of the issues around the games this year with that. And I don't know, Chris, maybe is that something from a Rule 40 perspective on the US OPC front that you want to kind of introduce the high level overview of, or
Yeah.
as well?
I'm the nearest guy to it being my fault that there's a Rule 40 because I'm in this construct. And so I'm happy to do that. So just for people that haven't been studying this, first, hooray, we're talking about something that's not COVID and about a games that is going to happen. So Rule 40 was a pretty hot controversy here a couple of years ago when the IOC was taking another look at it. And people might remember Rule 40 is in the IOC, the Olympic Charter, and it's Rule 40.3 in that book. And essentially what it says is the games are a marks-free and a sport-only environment. And one of the ways we observe that is athletes need to stop their marketing activities, their sponsorship activities during the period of the games. So it's a Rule 40 blackout as people talk about it. And then the IOC sort of says, but there are exceptions to this that acknowledge that athletes may be doing things that aren't at all having to do with the Olympics. And here's how you do those exceptions. And they're tied to the idea of it needs to be somebody who is in the market with you doing a thing enough months ahead of the games and will stay right through the games that we're satisfied it's not a games only marketing activity that you're involved in. The USOPC angle in this is that we're all subject to the charter, but the IOC kind of leaves to the NOCs in each country the enforcement of those rules domestically for its athletes. So Team USA athletes, domestic sponsorship activities in the US. So our own approach on Rule 40 has been changing too. And boy, this is really an interesting topic in America right now about athletes' opportunities to realize the economic benefit of their accomplishments. And that's in collegiate NIL, and it's in this Rule 40 space where we kind of came at it from a different perspective, saying the idea that everybody has to go dark during the games as a premise probably doesn't make that much sense. It probably treats athletes like they're fungible marketing tools rather than human beings with a whole set of concerns of their own. So the idea that you say you got to go dark during the games, or unless you've been in market for 8 or 10 months, that helps a handful of athletes that do have 12-month a year representation and sponsorships, and terrific for those athletes. But you know what we're seeing? We just finished the trials last night. We had athletes find out last night that they are Olympians or they're going to go to the Olympics. And we've got Paralympians who are in similar situations. So this idea of being in market weeks and weeks in advance isn't good enough. So we were all set to go, and now we finally get to do it. We're taking a different approach on Rule 40 as the IOC gave us room to make our own rule. And so what we're saying is, with respect, the idea of Rule 40 ought to be ambush marketing. Please make sure athletes, as you go out and get your own sponsors, and please don't have them ambushing the games, because that is at cross purposes. The IOC needs to have sponsors to put on the games. The USOPC needs sponsors to build the team and support the team. So let's just make sure that these things are far enough apart. And instead of saying you got to be in market months in advance, we created a different way of making sure that we don't step on each other's toes. And it's this personal sponsor commitment construct where any athlete that has a sponsor that wants to activate right up until the games or during the games, it's all good. You just go on a site and you register. You say, I'm going to have a sponsor and they're going to be doing this kind of thing. And then their sponsor clicks on what we call the personal sponsor commitment, this contract between that company and the USOPC that just says, I know I'm the athlete sponsor and not the team, and I'll stay away from the team marks. That way we figure if there's a problem or a misunderstanding, we all know who to reach for each other, but we can preserve what ought to be preserved, is that the athlete marketing should be separate from the team marketing. So that's the idea. Nobody's ever done it quite like this before, and that includes us. But for you two, Alana and CJ, I'm so interested in how that looks for you, because each of you might be involved with people that will have signed up under this thing here in the US. And so I'm interested in how that looks or feels from the athlete sponsor perspective and from the athlete rep perspective. I'll tell you that we'll see how we do. I think a number of people in other countries are wondering if this is going to work. We're feeling good about it. We've got more than 300 athletes have clicked in. Almost 200 athlete sponsors have signed the personal sponsor commitment. So we feel like people get it and that it ought to be able to work. But how does it look for you two?
Yeah, Alana, do you want to go first there?
Yeah, so well, first, I just want to say from the athlete perspective, we appreciate the changes to the Rule 40 guidelines from the USOPC. The prior guidelines were really onerous from the athlete's perspective because, like you said, Chris, they sort of forced us to plan with brands months prior versus, and we couldn't think of the spur of the moment. And with social media, that's just not how our deals run. We're often doing things, find a contract for a deal that's going to happen in 2 days, or an athlete performs better than expected, and we have an opportunity that comes up. So this really is a better reflection of the way that real life works. I think it will be interesting because I think in terms of when we have been having conversations with brands, and CJ, you obviously have a more intimate knowledge of how you guys deal with this on your end, but excuse me, when we're having conversations with the brands, it was difficult to explain, okay, well, we can only do thank you messages, and we can't have it really tied to saying thank you for all of your support and helping me win this gold medal. Like it's very tailored to trying to disassociate non-Olympic partners from the games, which makes sense. But I think it's going to be interesting to see how this all plays out, because it is new, it is different. And because the athlete is in the Olympics, I think it's always going to be hard to disassociate the post from the Olympics if it happens during the Olympics. So I think we're a little bit nervous as to what it's all going to look like, but it is a much better situation than it used to be, and it certainly opened up opportunities for clients that don't have these long-term partnerships, and who are able to source deals now. Like you said, we're just starting to find out for some of our athletes that made Team USA, another team from other countries, and able to do the work now, whereas before we were limited and couldn't do anything at this point in time.
Yeah, I mean, I think from the brand perspective, Rule 40 in generally is, since for me personally, London to Rio to now, Rule 40 is an area that is constantly up in the air and poses a lot of challenges and frustrations from a brand perspective. A lot of it dealing with the unknowns of Rule 40. For example, Puma as a global brand, we are positioning our campaigns as global campaigns. So we aren't running a US specific campaign, for instance. So our submissions, because for those that don't know, the way the process works on the global level is the IOC has a system where brands are meant to submit their what they call generic advertising through to the IOC for the IOC to basically approve. The word approve isn't exactly used anymore, but have notice of these campaigns so that they can see that there isn't a targeting of the Olympic Games or an escalation of specific Olympic athlete during the Olympic period, and an embargo date is set up where there's a blackout period. Now, for Puma, from the global perspective, again, we're submitting on a global campaign. Our current Olympic campaign is Only See Great, for example, is one of them that, and it's not an Olympic campaign, it's running during the Olympics. It's every year we have a new campaign during the summer and back to school time. So this gets sent to the IOC. The IOC is approving that on a global level. So in theory, they're going to all the NOCs. The NOCs globally are seeing those campaigns and providing feedback if there is any. And ultimately, the IOC is governing that global campaign. So for us specifically, we're not going, to Chris and the USOPC or Great Britain or any specific NOC governing body for approval on our campaigns, because that's all going through the NOC or the IOC, excuse me. That being said, smaller brands, they have the challenge of okay, maybe they're just a domestic US company. So they've got to figure out, okay, we're running a campaign in the US, we're running a campaign in Japan. It muddies the waters a lot on how these things can work in practice. If you're a global brand, you've got a business to run. So you can't change your campaigns on a country by country level. It's just impossible to do when you're a brand as big as Puma or Adi or Nike. There's no way to do it. So it's the submission process to the IOC, and then it's kind of see how it goes, because there's also an element of what are the penalties here. I think that's a lot of that is unclear as well. Is technically the brands aren't and the sponsors aren't, there is no relationship between the IOC and the brand. So if the guardrails for us, for example, are, the NOCs own the intellectual property related to the Olympics, the rings, the words Olympics, things like that. So if you're not infringing on anyone's IP, then you're running your business as usual. So to have these kind of arbitrary, almost, putting it on the penalties on the athlete in the end, and it's unclear what happens. Is a medal going to be taken from an athlete? Are they going to be fined? What are the penalties? So it becomes a challenge from a brand standpoint. You don't want to put your athletes in a position to be penalized, some unknown penalty, but at the same time you have a business to run, and you support these athletes throughout the course of 3 years and 11 months leading up to that moment. So you should be able to activate your athletes during that time.
It's such a good point about that's the problem. A problem with the basic construct of Rule 40 is exactly as you say, CJ. It's the athlete who is at stake in that thing. I mean, I'm sure the IOC feels the same way I do, which is I would never want to be punishing a Team USA athlete for some kind of commercial issue that I've got going. And I see a good question in the chat from Danielle about, well, why you have these sponsor commitments, these contracts between the USOPC and the sponsor. Part of it is because now I know who to talk to at the sponsor. I don't even want to bother the athlete any more than I have to, much less would I want to be a part of a conversation where we're saying, how do we punish this athlete with pulling a medal or whatever it's going to be? That's a very difficult position that the IOC is in, and I wouldn't want to be there either.
And I think one of the interesting points of the personal sponsor commitment is that there's a privity then being created between the brand and the USOPC, for example, that doesn't currently exist. Because a lot of that is between the, the guardrails are more from, we understand who owns Olympic IP. And that's easy to know. So it's creating a different relationship that doesn't exist, that I think is a challenge, from a brand perspective. So Chris, you're nodding your head there like that. I'm sure you guys are aware of that as well. So it's an interesting layer, in terms of loosening things, because at the same time, and there's a different approach going on in Europe, for example, where over the last 2 years, the German cartel and the German, which is their kind of antitrust governing body, and the German Olympic Sports Confederation have really weakened the impact of Rule 40 on limiting athlete rights. And, Germany has massively kind of overhauled their Rule 40 system. And I think there's a reasonable question as to, does Europe take up a lot of that cause? Because oftentimes, in the European Union, there will be if a member state rules a certain way, the European Commission will take that up on a broader scale. So you've got differing ends of the spectrum, I think, where the IOC's position is one. You see some different things happening in Europe, and you see some different things happening in the US. So there's so much variance in this whole issue right now.
Yeah, and then you also have some countries or some NOCs that haven't issued any guidelines, and you're just trying to figure out what's the best case. What do I advise my athlete to do? And if, like you said, CJ, small brands, it might not even be a brand that is domestic US. It might really be a very local brand, like a small city where the athlete is from, so they have no idea how to sort of integrate themselves and figure out the application of the rule.
So I know we got to, and can't wait to turn to Rule 50. We shouldn't leave too little time for that, but maybe it's fair for me to ask you two this question, because it's hard for me to say, it's meaner for me to say something about it. In light of everything we're talking about, is there a future for Rule 40? Does it work? from the athlete perspective or from the athlete sponsor perspective?
From a sponsor perspective, I think ultimately my feeling is no in the long run. I think there has to be, and not to delay on the point too long, but I mean, there's an understanding of why the IOC and the different NOCs, are seeking to do what they do. These sponsors pay, a lot of money for these sponsorships, and they're seeking to protect their partners, which I think every brand, every company is trying to do from a certain perspective there. But that being said, I think at least in our space, there's opportunities to find different paths. I think you look, I'll use some old Olympians, but take Usain Bolt on the Puma side, for example. One of the greatest Olympians of all time. And let's face it, a lot of Olympic sports they're not the NFL, they're not Major League Baseball, they're not Premier League Soccer. These sports need to be amplified more than once every 4 years, to be honest. And, if you can have someone like a Puma, let's say in Rio, have an Instagram post saying, watch Usain Bolt run for a 100-meter world record at 10 p.m. or in this time or something. That can help the Olympics grow and these sports grow. So whether it's Puma or it's Nike and Justin Gatlin, or Under Armour with Michael Phelps when he was swimming. I mean, I think there are opportunities there that, because Rule 40 stands in the way, these, especially on the apparel and footwear brands, there's a real opportunity for brands to help grow the sports by working together the right way.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I think we're moving in that direction, and it's interesting you mentioned the NIL and collegiate athletes, but I think the idea is to give athletes more opportunities to utilize their name, image, likeness. And I think that when we have such rules that are making it much harder to do that, and going back to the social media posts and just thank you posts, I mean, those are so limited. Brands don't always want to stick around for something like that. We haven't seen as much traction as we would if those were just traditional social media posts, which nowadays is what a lot of our athletes are getting. They're not getting those TV deals. They're not getting major production type of sponsorship arrangements. They're getting social media deals for those athletes that aren't, in the top 5 major league sports in the US. And so I think that my hope at least is that we're moving in a direction to where we don't need something like Rule 40. I think it's easy for the Olympic sponsors to be identified as such, and for non-Olympic sponsors to sort of follow more limited parameters to where it's not ambush marketing. I think we can all play in that space. People do it for major leagues. The sponsors that aren't NBA sponsors figure out a way to market their athletes and not run in violation of the rules that the NBA has. So I think it's something that we can do, and the hope is that we'll get there.
I'm back. I lost the internet. I was in a total panic. I apologize to everyone. I think, are we done with Rule 40 and ready to move on to Rule 50? Is that where we are?
I think, yeah, that's what we think.
So,
Okay, good. So Rule 50 is named, Rule 50 of the Olympic Charter is named Advertising, Demonstrations, Propaganda. The current focus has been on demonstrations and propaganda, but there are 2 elements to Rule 50. And actually the IOC Athletes Commission has asked for them to be separated into 2 separate rules. So the first part of it is, and I'll read it, except as may be authorized by the IOC Executive Board on an exceptional basis, no form of advertising or other publicity shall be allowed in and above the stadia, venues, and other competition areas. So this is the IOC's clean venues policy, and it applies all the way around. There's no boards around the venues. The only identification is let's say on the hurdles in the track, or there will be the look of the games all around the venues. And in some sports, the particular international federation will have identification, like on the volleyball nets. Okay, so the second part of Rule 50 says, no kind of demonstration, I swear I didn't write this, it's a translation. No kind of demonstration or political, religious, or racial propaganda is permitted in any Olympic sites, venues, or other areas. Now that's the one that everybody's focused on right now in this era that we are in. Bylaw 3, which expands on these, says no form of publicity or propaganda, commercial or otherwise, may appear on persons, on sportswear, accessories, or more generally on any article of clothing or equipment whatsoever worn by all competitors, team officials, other team personnel, and other participants in the Olympic Games, except for the identification as defined in paragraph 8 below, of the manufacturer of the article or equipment concerned, provided that such identification shall not be marked conspicuously for advertising purposes. So this is something where the commercial identification aspect of this is something where the IOC has issued detailed guidelines regarding authorized identification. The USOPC also has its own regulations for the athletes regarding what uniforms they can wear where, which isn't really related to Rule 50, but this whole area of identification is very specific. Now, the penalties for violating this advertising part of Rule 50 can be disqualification of the person or delegation concerned, or withdrawal of the accreditation, which basically means you're kicked out of the games, and any further measures and sanctions which may be pronounced by the IOC Executive Board. All right, so now over to the protests part of Rule 50. So up until Friday, the IOC Athletes Commission had made a decision based on a survey that was conducted of 3,547 athletes from 185 NOCs. And the results found that 67% of those supported a ban on podium protests. So no podium or other Olympic venue protests. Recently, the Athletes Commission, and when I say recently, Friday, the Athletes Commission has reevaluated this, and they're now proposing to allow protests somewhere. We don't know where. It's been reported that it could be pre-competition. So let's say on the swim deck, for a football, soccer match, they can take a knee as they enter the stadium. That's what's being reported. Anything the IOC Athletes Commission adopts goes to the IOC Executive Board and has to be approved. Now, the IOC Executive Board approved the previous Athletes Commission guidelines and recommendations in full. And those, as I said, banned protests. Now, I picked some interesting statements from the IOC Athletes Commission recommendations. One of them is, we believe that the example we set by competing with the world's best while living in harmony in the Olympic Village is a uniquely positive message to send to an increasingly divided world. So that was kind of the slant that they took. And the other thing that they pointed out, which is something that does not get pointed out that often, but it is really important, is that the IOC has attempted, in spite of regular attacks, to stay above the fray of politics. And one of their rules is that the head of state who opens the games has a very, very specific speech. So, you know, when you invite the head of state to come and open the games, that person is thinking, yay, rah, rah, I can do my whole political, gloss on how our country's great and we're welcome to the Olympic Games. No, this is what the head of state can say. I declare open the Games of Tokyo, in this case, celebrating the 32nd Olympiad of the modern era, period. In addition, the IOC rules require that no government officials are allowed to appear in any medal ceremony. Now that's kind of not really how it works in practice, because some of the IOC members are government officials, but they are not there in their capacity as government officials, and there aren't that many of those. So the penalties for a breach of the protest rules have not been established. It was handed over to the IOC's Legal Affairs Commission to clarify the range of sanctions, taking into consideration each case, and that has not, we don't know what that is as of right now. It would be enforced by the disciplinary commission. So I want to hear from you guys on this. So there's two parts to Rule 50. So Alana, can you talk about the pros and cons of Rule 50, both parts of Rule 50, please?
Okay, I will be very quick on the first one, since I know everybody is probably more interested at this point in the second one. But this is similar to Rule 40. I mean, in terms of trying to keep the sponsors of the teams and the Team USA, for example, uniforms, trying to not delineate from that to another sponsor. But just so everybody's on the same page, just the USOPC has a list for different sports of what they call, I think, specialized equipment, so personal performance gear. So for example, swimming, that might be goggles, could be headband for outdoor sports, basketball shoes, running spikes. So you can wear whatever brand you want of those, but they can't be any different than what's been in the market. It can't be like, the Nike label is just, totally, well, if Nike weren't a team sponsor, let's say, and another brand, the shoe company brand, just taking over the image of the headband so that it appears as though they are an Olympic sponsor. I get it. I mean, I understand you want to keep the sponsorship here, but sometimes to tell a brand it's got to be this tiny and it can't be any different, and you got to follow all these parameters. It just sometimes is a frustrating conversation with third parties, is to figure out how to live within those means. But we've done it, and I think for the most part, it's not overly complicated. For the second part in the demonstrations, I think what's been interesting is to read that study for the IOC Athletes Commission, and to take yourself out of what's been happening in the US over these past 15, 16 months. It's a little bit interesting because for us, I think a lot of us will say, well, racial and social justice, these are not political issues. They've been politicized, but they should be taken totally out of the category of politics. It's not propaganda. Nobody should disagree that these are things that we should be fighting for on the one hand, and fighting against if we're talking about hate on the other hand. And so I think our clients really appreciate on the Team USA side what the USOPC put out in terms of its guidelines on what it was going to allow at the Olympic and Paralympic trials. The hope is that it would be something similar for the Olympics, because I think we have people already who have said that no matter what, they're not going to be silenced during the Olympic Games. And I don't know what the penalties are. Maybe you said we don't really know what they are at this point. But I think we're going to see people kneeling, putting their fists in the air during the Olympics. And the question at this point is, where do they do that? If it's not on the podium, where are they doing that? Because it's going to happen, and what are the penalties for doing something like that?
I mean, the IOC Athletes Commission recommendation was not on the podium, not in the Olympic Village, not during competition. So that's what they're talking about easing up. CJ, what do you see as the pros and cons of Rule 50?
Yeah, I mean, I think, to Alana's point, the piece about manufacturer identification is pretty straightforward. I mean, it's something that's been going on a long time. I think it's to promote the over commercialization kind of ethos of the games. I think the interesting and evolving part is that the other piece we're talking about here, and it's challenging. I mean, Puma, for example, is a brand that one of our partners is Tommy Smith, who is famous for the raised fist in the air, and there's a legacy of that. So it's a balance, because again, you referenced that the survey that the IOC Athletes Commission had taken, those numbers, the 67% against kind of protesting, and that's a significant number. I think part of the question is where are those numbers coming from, what countries. There's variables that go along with that, but it's a balancing act. On the one hand, if you open the door to one form of speech, you can get a counter form of speech evolving, whether it's a highly political type of leader in a certain country, or there's a number of doors that open that I think strike a balance. And the USOPC is I think from the US perspective done a good job at trying to create a scenario where there's doors open there to do it a certain way. And I think it's going to continue to evolve as it develops and this popularity of movements grow.
Chris, you're going to have the last word because we're running out of time.
I'll try to make this tight, but this is a fascinating issue. It is exactly as you both have said, it's just not easy. But to preview for people watching as we look forward to the games, there's Rule 50 and the component that prohibits demonstrations of any kind. We have a counterpart rule that applies to the trials in the US. So from January until now, all the time I wasn't spending on the COVID rules was spending on trying to articulate a new approach for USOPC on demonstrations. We didn't try to make it up on our own. We worked with the Council on Racial and Social Justice that we put together with athlete leaders and DE&I leaders here in the US. And then we consulted with teams and experts, and boy, I can't tell you all the hammering that went on. On teamusa.org, you can see our trials rules on that. And they were in place for the trials that finished finally last night. And I will tell you, there were probably a dozen or fewer incidents that took place at different trials, which under the Rule 50 construct would have been not allowed at trials under our rules, and certainly would be running afoul of Rule 50 at the games. But because of our new rule, which creates a safe harbor for demonstrations in support of racial and social justice, every single one of them was okay with our rules. So in the US, at least, we've taken a position, and like you're saying, CJ, it's not obvious to anybody exactly what the right position should be, but we've taken one. What's going to be interesting to see, and this is going to be the subject of some tension, is we've already signaled that when we go to the games, our approach as an NOC and an NPC is going to be the same. So we've already announced that we will not be part of sanctioning any athlete who demonstrates at the games, so long as it's a racial and social justice demonstration within this safe harbor. But as I think maybe you pointed out at the outset, this is not our party. This is the IOC's party, and they will make the rules ultimately. So a thing to watch, if you like to keep track of these things, is what's going to happen on the day when someone does something that is within our rules and not within the IOC rules. This is going to be an interesting summer.
One of the alternatives that the IOC has in terms of sanctions is to send it over to the International Federation or the NOC. So we'll see if that's an alternative that they take. Okay, well, thank you, you guys. I'm going to have to watch the recording and see what happened. I'm really sorry. You always are, like, this is not going to happen to me, but it did. Anyway, so thank you, CJ, for initiating this panel. Thank you, Chris. Thank you, Alana. And stay tuned, everybody, for the virtual outreach event, which will be sometime in late September. Okay. Bye.
Bye.
Thanks
Thanks,
everyone.
Maidie. Thanks, everyone.